So I'm going to introduce a little bit Matthias Frielingsdorf. I hope that's right. He leads a researcher team at iVerify. He used to work at Deutsche Bahn and taking a lot of care of smartphones and tablet and testing mobile security software and security product, or like he used to work for like security products for T-Systems. He wrote a master thesis on iOS exploits and malware detection, and he has presented like his research on lots of conferences like the Black Hat, OBTS, LabsCon, and now here. So yeah, he's quite an expert on iOS malware, and he's gonna talk a lot about it. As for the talk, from Pegasus to Predator, the evolution of commercial spyware on iOS, I don't think I need to explain much more. I guess he's going to do that himself. So give a round of applause to Matthias.
Talk from Pegasus to Predator, the evolution of iOS commercial spyware. Nothing more to say about me, except that if I'm not doing iOS malware and exploitation, I really like to play basketball and do board games. And today we're going to talk about the history of iOS commercial spyware. We're going to talk about what are current means in order to detecting iOS commercial spyware. And I'm going to give you like very current state, like how the industry looks like, and an outlook on how mobile spyware might, or like iOS spyware might look in the future. Let's start with the history, and let's start with what this talk is not about. I'm not going to talk about stalkerware, spyware, or any other mass market spyware for iOS. I'm also not going to talk about the justification or the legality of commercial spyware. I'm not interested in that at all. I'm morely focused on the technicalities, and I'm not going to talk about jailbreaking. Some definitions. So what is commercial spyware for this talk? It's an offensive capability which is provided by companies for nation states. It's a spyware implant that is used for data exfiltration. It often uses zero-click or one-click exploit chains, and very often zero-day exploits are used to infect devices even on the latest version of iOS. And it usually infects individual targets. It's also referenced by other entities as private sector offensive actors or mercenary spyware. Why am I talking about commercial spyware? Because there's multiple known abuses against civil society, journalists, or businesses where commercial spyware has not been used to detect terrorism or other institutions. And a lot of those abuses has been made public by the civil society space over the last 8 years. Commercial spyware is non-trivial to detect on iOS, and it very often has novel or interesting vulnerabilities or exploits which are used. So infections are often low probability, but if a device is infected, it has a very high impact for that person. And there were cases where persons have been infected with spyware first and afterwards have been killed. One of the most famous ones is the case of a journalist, Khashoggi, who was killed in an embassy in Turkey. But there is other cases where journalists around the world are very often being infected with spyware first to find out their location, and then there is physical harm which follows. So it's very important for us that we have detection capability for such spyware available. This is just my only slides that I promise that I have on jailbreaks and some of the comparison, but very often those terms are confusing and people are getting those wrong. A jailbreak is meant for a user to liberate their own device. So that means the infiltration is a manual installation, the target customer is the user, the affected group is the user, there's lots of device changes, it's very noisy and it's very easy to detect. Commercial spyware, on the other hand, uses 0 days, it uses zero-click attacks, it's meant for governments and the affected group are individual targets, it's stealth and it's very hard to detect. So if someone tries you to tell you, yeah, I'm detecting jailbreaks, and thus I'm detecting the jailbreak, I'm detecting malware, this is not true. These are very, very different things, and the jailbreak is just what we all like to do, is getting control over our own devices, while spyware is meant for something completely different. Now, let's look at a couple of those spyware samples in the past. And usually the first that everyone is referring to is the first case of Pegasus, which was discussed on the 24.3C3, or maybe a bit later, about 2016 by Max Barzali here. This one was detected because there was a journalist that received a suspicious-looking SMS. He sent that SMS to Citizen Lab, and then Citizen Lab clicked on the link in that SMS, and they found that there was a lot of interesting things happening on their device. Then Citizen Lab partnered up with Lookout, and they got a hold of the malware implant, could analyze it, and this was the first public known case of a commercial spyware sample that was retrieved and fully analyzed. At the time, this spyware was pretty amateurish. They were using public jailbreak techniques and public other stuff. They were very, very noisy on the system, and they were, quite frankly, pretty easy to detect at the time. The second sample of Pegasus in 2021, forced entry, was a lot more advanced. The exploit that was used here is pretty famous, and if you haven't heard about it, I highly recommend to check out Google Project Zero's blog post about how that worked. This time, iMessage was used as an infection vector, which means you have a zero-click attack, so it's only enough if you know the iCloud account or the phone number of a victim, and then you can send them the exploit payload and you're getting control of the device. There is nothing that a user can stop except from turning off their device in order to execute that attack. This was a very, very public case. Lots of organizations have talked about it. I can highly recommend also to check out Amnesty's research. There's a whole section, 50 pages of forensic methodology behind that. But as iMessage was used here as an infection vector, we moved from an n-click attack to a zero-click attack. And this has a lot of advantages for the attacker. Now, if I'm using an n-click attack, I need to convince my user every single time to click on that link again if I want to reinfect the device. So if I need to do that, this is pretty much noisy, so maybe I'll just try to use a persistence mechanism on the device. So I don't have to reinfect the device. Now, if I use persistence mechanisms, I'm changing something on the device. That also means that it's a lot easier to detect such attacks. Because every single time the device boots, there is one malicious process that might be coming up. If I have a zero-click infection vector, I get onto the device, I do whatever I want there, I'll leave the device after 2 hours, and if I want to come back, I'll just come back. This is good for an attacker, but it's very hard for us in order to detect such attacks, especially with iMessage and that the communication is end-to-end encrypted. What we could also see there is that Pegasus started a lot to clean up their traces and hiding. They were deleting entries and data usage.sqlite, but they did a not so complete job, which left a specific trace which allowed us to detect that as well. And they were launching from a directory which is now pretty often abused by malware. That is also automatically cleaned after a reboot. So if you have a spyware sample there and your device is rebooted, it's going to be deleted. And that directory is only accessible by root, which also means that it's very hard to inspect that device. In 2022, they got a little bit better. They used the same directory, but they also started to clean up shutdown log. In that specific case, they were cleaning up everything else in shutdown log, which is also pretty noisy and once again leaves a pretty space. They were having a helper which spawns from private var temp from a directory, and they were disguising as normal system processes. So now it would look like that Pegasus is user event agent, WebKit, media server D, some of the processes that you would normally expect on an iOS device. So if you would look in the backup and you see that some of those processes would be having network connections, you would say, yeah, it's normal that WebKit is doing network connections. It's what it should do. In 2023, we had a BlastPass exploit chain that was discovered, and we were able to get a specific, extract a specific sample of that. I'm not going to talk a lot about that because we're going to talk about a lot more later in this talk. In 2019, there was a very interesting case. This was, I called it originally a campaign against Uyghurs that was discovered by Google Project Zero and Google Tag. This was later attributed to iSoon based on the leaks earlier this year. The interesting case about that campaign is that it was going on over 3 years. There were 14 different vulnerabilities which have been used to infect the group of Uyghurs time over time again. There were 3 different iOS versions which were supported. Every single time it was an infection vector which was coming in via WebKit, and there was plenty of IOCs available. This campaign was even like transmitting every single piece of data fully unencrypted over the internet. So everyone that would have been in some of the steps in the network control chain could have just easily read every single personal detail about that person. That changed a little bit later, but at the time, operational security was just not a thing. Now, 2022, we had Hermit. That was another case that was detected by Google Tag. The interesting case here is that this is a site-loaded application, and this site-loaded application made it onto the device because they were working now with mobile network carriers together, and they were shutting down the internet connection, sending the victim an SMS and telling them, if you want to get access to your mobile network again, you need to download our nice carrier application. And once people downloaded that application and installed it, this app would contain a couple of public and also non-public exploits in order to then attack the device. This is the only case that I know that commercial spyware was actually using an app as an infection vector. There might be more cases, but it is actually pretty noisy. Then we have the famous case of Operation Triangulation, which was also discussed extensively last year by Kaspersky. Once again, we have an infection vector that is iMessage. We have a couple of IOCs around that. We have processes, files, URLs, and emails. And this one was detected by network and forensic analysis. So Kaspersky looked at their own Wi-Fi network monitoring, found a suspicious domain, looked at a backup, found a suspicious process, and this is where the whole chain unfolded. The interesting case here is that everything started with that malicious domain and the backup agent process inside of data usage SQLite. This database is public since years because Amnesty made it public when they found Pegasus in there. So whoever built this very, very expensive spyware chain made a massive operational security failure by not checking that database for that one process. And also backup agent is a legitimate iOS process, but it's not used since iOS 4. So anyone who would use that specific database and would see that process would immediately think this is super suspicious. So everything else in that chain is so highly bureaucratic and very expensive, so that is just a very interesting failure, if you ask me. In terms of cleanup, what we could see here is they were deleting crash logs, they were deleting iMessage attachments, they were removing traces from iMessage-related databases, they were disguising as a normal system process, and they were spawning system processes for cleanups as well. Okay, let's briefly chat about Predator. Infection vector was here WebKit at the time. So it's a one-click attack. It was discovered by Citizen Lab, interestingly, on a device that was at the same time infected with Pegasus. It's a very interesting blog post to look at. It was extensively talked about by Google Tag, but also Cisco Talos last year released a lot of interesting research how Predator and Alien and Total work together. At the time, it was, I think, the first public case where a business person like a manager from Meta was attacked, and it's not only a single civil society case. Even in 2021, Predator did a lot of cleanup or hiding. They were launching from private var temp, helper spawns from there as well, and they were already disguising as normal system processes. Once again, WebKit or user event agents are very normal things. The second version of Predator is a lot more interesting. This was completely rewritten. While the first version of Predator was Python-based and they had a Python loader that were executing to make it applicable to Android and iOS, the second version was completely rewritten in Objective-C. It still uses WebKit as an infection vector, but they use WebKit as a zero-click. And if you want to find out how that exactly works, I can highly recommend the talk by Amnesty that was done last year at CCC. The interesting thing about this specific version was that we got access to the validation steps and the cleanup step that we're doing. And we're still checking for running processes from private var temp. They were now checking for additional log monitoring. They were checking if developer mode is enabled, and they were checking for additional root certificate authorities. And that specific sample was getting notified when the device would be shut down. so they're not going to leave any traces inside of shutdown log. The two points highlighted in purple are interesting because developer mode is something you can enable on your phone, and additional root certificate authorities is normally something that a company would install on a device if they want to use internal resources. So in both cases, the malware would not infect the phone if this is present, so actually enabling developer mode would have prevented any kind of access. I highly doubt that this is still the case after it has been public, because otherwise they would not infect any devices anymore. The last sample I'm briefly mentioning today is NoClip. NoClip is only mentioned by a talk by Clément from Google Tech at Hexacon this year. It used in WebKit as an infection vector, and then it was running a small implant. The very interesting thing about NoClip is that there is like a massive cleanup that is going on. There is a function that is called Pwn Citizen Lab. And after every single step of data exfiltration, they would delete every single crash log, delete all unified logs, delete aggregates, clean application identity, and launch dlogs. And this is after every single step of exfiltration. I counted it. I think this method is like 14 times called. So there is a lot of cleanup activity going on, which is probably a way to detect this specific sample itself if you can access that data. Now, if we're looking about the commercial spyware over time, what we could see is that the first version of Pegasus started as an end-click attack. They had a persistency module. They were not doing any kind of cleanup, and we were able to both recover exploits and the implant. The later found samples in 2021 and 2023 were already using zero clicks. They will have no persistence module anymore, and there is a lot more cleanup and stealth that is going on. We were able to recover some of the exploits, but since 2021, there is no public sample of the actual implant, the kernel exploits, or sandbox escapes that have been used by Pegasus. So even though we can stop the initial exploitation, it could still be that the sandbox escape itself might still be unpatched. For Predator, they started as an end-click. In the same way, they started as an end-click in 2021. They had a persistency module. They were doing already some cleanup and stealth and learned, but we still were able to exploit, to recover the exploit and both the implant. On the 2023 module, they choose a zero-click module. They were starting to do a lot more cleanup and stealth. We were able to find the exploit, but there is no public available sample available. There's only the loader that is part of the first initial exploit chain. In case of iSoon, it was an end-click attack. There was no persistency, there was no cleanup or any stealth, and both implant and exploit recovery was fully done. And in the case of Hermit, it's an app. This is pretty easy, so all exploits and all implants were recovered. I don't know if they did any cleanup or any specific stealths. I was not able to analyze that sample yet. And for Operation Triangulation, we had a zero-click attack. We had cleanup and a lot of stealths, and luckily Kaspersky was able to recover both the exploits and the implant. So if we sort this over time instead of by sample, we can clearly see that all the later chains are moving step by step more to the zero-click attack surface. So we're not having any persistency modules anymore, and we're very often are only able to gather the initial exploitation. If we're looking at IOCs that are left behind by these spyware samples, as for the case of Pegasus, we can see there's very often crashes available. There's emails available for the iMessage surface. There's files available or URLs available during the initial infiltration. When there's an orange or yellow color, I think there might be crashing, but we don't have any specific crashes which were recovered, so it's very likely that crashes are an IOC. And we also had, every single time we had processes which can be used as an IOC, or we have dedicated files available or domains for the command and control infrastructure. Same for Predator. We have likely crashes. We have an URL which was recovered in 2021. And we have information about the exact processes spawned, about some of the files which are left behind, and about the attack infrastructure. Same for iSoon. For Hermit, in this case, we don't have any infiltration because it's just a side-loaded app that is installed, but we have everything else for the implant. And for operation triangulation, we have the exact same things. So if we are sorting this now over time again, we can also see that this is not really changing, and the techniques of the attackers have not really changed in terms of IOCs, except that they're now using a little bit different ways of getting onto the device. Now, if we're sorting this a little bit different, and if we're sorting this by category, if we want to detect such commercial spyware, there's a couple of interesting data categories that we want or need to get from a device. We would need to be able to gather an application list in order to detect hermit. We want to be able to detect crash logs in order to find the initial infiltration of a lot of these samples. If we get access to a file list, we can find some of the files which are left behind. Network data is always used in terms of command and control infrastructure. And if we get access to a process list, we would be able to find a lot of those samples running like live on a device. Okay, let's talk about how we're actually detecting, or how this commercial spyware was detected. Once again, this is a target data that we want to look at. Let's start by talking first about what you can do with an iOS app that is running on a device. Frankly, you can't do anything at all. The only thing that you can actually reliably do is you can check if there is a specific file at a specific file path if you know the exact full qualified path of that file. If you don't know that, so let's say there is a malware running from private var temp and it's called file 1. If this changes to file 2, you're lost. You don't have a way of detecting that anymore because you are not able to get a full listing of all the files. Obviously, you can do a lot on the network side. You can monitor domains, you can run a local VPN and get like the full IP traffic, but that's it. With a modern MDM running on the device, you're able to get a list of the applications which are installed. So this is great for detecting hermit, but also that's it. There is another method available that you can use if you would run a desktop application on a Windows, on a Linux, on a Mac client, and you would plug your phone into your computer. You get that nice little trust dialog, and if you would trust the specific computer, you can gather a lot more information from the device. You're able to get a full list of all the running applications. You're able to gather crash logs from the device. You're able to capture network traffic, but also that's it. This is great for detecting like initial infiltration and also for detecting hermit. If we're looking at backups, and backups have been used very, very often, and here's just a very sample extraction of some of the modules which are available with MVT, then we can see that in backups we get lots of interesting information about files which were left on the device, about processes, about network behavior, configuration profiles, and about some of the like access permissions. Backups is a very, very common tool of analyzing it, and there is one excellent tool available, which is MVT for this, which was developed by Amnesty International, and it was like massively talked about in 2022 with their discovery. And I can highly recommend to like normally do backups and look at this. I'm not going to extensively talk about the details of that. I've done multiple talks of that, and I'm going to leave you behind multiple resources that you can check later on. But it's just for a brief overview here. So with a backup, we're able to gather that app list. We're able to get some file information, some network information, and process information. Now, the next thing that we can use is something that is called sysdiagnose. Sysdiagnose is a normal diagnostic tool that Apple is using. If your iPhone behaves faulty and you're calling the support, very often they run a sysdiagnose and the backup together, background together with you, or you go to an Apple store and they're going to do that as well. Sysdiagnoses have also been used extensively by normal traditional forensics, and there's excellent papers available. Since last year, the European Union Commission CERT actually released a tool, the sysdiagnose analysis framework, that is just dedicated at malware analysis, and I can highly recommend to check it out. This is a very brief overview of how you can run a sysdiagnose, but Apple has their own IT training that you can just follow, and there's multiple guides available that allow you to do this. So with a sysdiagnose, we're actually able to get any of the data sets that we want. We can get information on apps, we can get some crashes, we can get some file information, network and process information. So if we're summing this up, that means the very traditional detections, like using a mobile security application, using an MDM, just the two tools are not alone sufficient in order to detect new samples of commercial spyware, but they are great to check for like some of the old samples where IOCs are available. But if you want to find something new, you need to use some of the iOS forensics via a desktop app, a backup, a sysdiagnose. And the more data you can get, the better it is. There is some challenges with forensic analysis. And that is the sad thing is sysdiagnose takes roughly 10 to 15 minutes. An iTunes backup may even take some hours depending on the size, and still some of the latest iPhones are just shipping a USB 2 connection. So if you're trying to transfer a terabyte backup of a phone over USB 2, I'll suggest you get a couple of coffees. Both need user interaction, and all of those tools are just require some knowledge of IT. So if you're talking to a journalist in Jordan and you're trying to help them to install Python on their computer, which is pretty outdated, and also to run some of the tools, this is absolutely a challenge. And if you're trying to get a backup from someone maybe in India where the internet connection is not really stable and you're trying to transmit gigabytes of data, you can sometimes just take weeks. We just ended up actually shipping the phone via post. That was a lot faster than waiting for the internet connection to be stable enough. And also something that I have to mention here, a lot of the public available IOCs are very, very old. This is great for checking for malware that is from 2021, 2022, but if you want to find some of the newer samples, a lot of organizations are now keeping their IOCs and detections hidden in order to not expose that to any spyware vendor so that they can use this. So if we're summarizing forensic analysis, then it pretty much looks like this. There's different pros and cons, but all of those require user interaction, so that is not something that we can do without the user or something that we can just even automatically check in the background. Let's talk about BlastPass. In September last year, Apple closed a vulnerability in iOS 16.6.1, and there were actually 2 vulnerabilities which were closed. And on the same day, Citizen Lab published a report about a new attack that was attributed to NSO that was using passkey attachments. In October 2023, I got a customer contact, and they told me they had a potentially compromised device. And the data sources that I had available at the time were crash logs, an iTunes backup, and some telemetry data. And the analysis tools that I used were some scripts, MVT, and some scripts for checking the telemetry data as well. And what I was trying to find is any suspicious activity like processes executing from temp, processes doing dedicated network calls, or specific files written to disk, or some processes which were crashing repeatedly. And when I was looking at the crash logs, I could find something that immediately sparked my eyes. I had 25 crashes of the HomeD process. That was a short break. And then I had 35 crashes of messages blast or service. And that's absolutely suspicious. So when I looked at the HomeD crashes, they actually looked pretty normal. So there was nothing in there. But once I started to look at the messages blast or service crashes, I could see there's a little bit more severe crash message. And then I could also see there's lots of time that there is a plist file which is decoded from an NSKeyed archiver, and this just goes on forever. So that was definitely suspicious for me. Luckily, I had a backup available, so when I checked the backup for the times where I had those crashes, I could see that IM Transfer Agent, that is a process responsible for downloading iMessage attachments, was downloading iMessage attachments multiple times. And when I looked at files that I had available, I found 8 different sample.pkpass files which were sent to that device. When I looked into that pkpass file, I could see, which is a passkey attachment, I could see there were 5 different files there, but the logo and the background, both had a file ending of PNG, were not matching the specific file type. So once I investigated the logo.png a little bit more, I could see there was a binary plist which was attached to it. And this binary plist had an object at offset 11 that contained an NS expression. So, what is an NS expression? First of all, that is an exploit technique that has been used by Pegasus in 2021 before. It has been used by Operation Triangulation. But in essence, this is just a way of calling arbitrary receivers with a selector name and arguments, and without any mitigations, that would allow you to call every single part of the Objective-C runtime. So essentially, this is a very nice way of dynamically executing code on iOS. And it's very naturally that this technique has been exploited by attackers time over time again. So this NS expression had 4 different payloads, payload CS, a payload C, payload X, and a normal payload. This is how it looks like. And at the time, I had to do some Python magic in order to get it a little bit easier formatted. Then it looks like this. But still, this were 2,539 lines of NS expression. So it took me quite some while in order to figure out what was going on here. And after the NS expression, it had a payload. It called a payload CS, that is a config file. Then you had a payload C that contained a couple of other sub-payloads. And you had another payload that was calling payload X, and this one was encrypted. So that is the summary. The config file didn't contain any iPads. Is maybe because iPads are usually not able to open wallet passes, but maybe there is a different reason for that. But still, at the time, I just had the overall structure, and this old format was not really good enough to read, so it was time for a little bit more Python magic. And after that, we got this down to something like this, which looks like some pseudo Objective-C kind of code, but it's definitely good enough to read. And the whole payload is now down to 650 lines. I'm just skipping over that for time. The config file itself was very interesting because it contained a symbol name for DLSim. It contained an interesting looking smiley and a reference to OSLog_T. And that specific DLSim is interesting because very often if you can access Objective-C, you still want to call some arbitrary C functions, but on iOS those are packed, which means if you do not have a packed bypass, then you're not able to call those functions, and DLSim would give you a valid signature for that if you can call it. So I was trying to find DLSim, and I stumbled about 24 times of a weird number which was called inside of that pattern. And you could see that there is then some names to another function like DLOpen, and there is something like NSInvocation that is called, and that definitely looked interesting. So when I translated that number back into hex, it was -2, and when I looked a little bit further, this actually was matching the invocation and implementation for DLSim. So that meant that this specific sample still needed to contain some sort of a packed bypass or an unfixed call. And at the end, the smiley is actually the solution in order to get to the packed bypass, but unfortunately, due to time, I will skip this to a blog post that we're going to release. Good. Let's skip over some of this. Some evasive measures that the sample was doing, it was setting OSLog to 0, so they were suppressing logs, they were avoiding jetsam events, and there were lots of other functionality that was used in order to decrypt the next stage. So the overall structure of this was, at the end, it was loading some frameworks, extracting a config file, checking if the device is in config. If not, it would exit. Then it was loading payload C, preparing DLSim, prepare some functions, and then afterwards it would call payload C 3 times, and payload C would actually read an object from the stack. And they were using those objects that were reading from the stack in order to send XPC messages, receive XPC messages. And they would do this all over again until they find the right one. If they don't find the right one, they exit. And if they find the right XPC message, they would they would use that XPC data object as a key. If it's not the right key, they would exit. And if it's the right key, they would decrypt payload X. So what is likely happening here is what they're using is the existing XPC connection to EM agent in order to receive the next iMessages to parse. And then they were using some of the next iMessages as the decryption method in order to get to the next stage. This is actually damn smart. Because if you supply your key as part of an iMessage, and you're still in control over there, it's very, very hard to retrieve the next decryption key for the next stage. So if I would try to analyze that backup and the key is actually never written to disk, I'm not able to get access to that key. And they have pretty much control over that. And they can very easily send the key over iMessage with additional samples, so on and so forth, and app use that infrastructure, and makes it very, very hard in order to exfiltrate the payload. Yeah, and at the very end, they would also exit to avoid that the specific part of messages blast service that would also normally exit normally, so writing anything else to disk. Yeah. So what we could see here, the first part that we've seen, the crashing of multiple processes in home D, is actually used in order to not burn any vulnerabilities. What they're doing is they're crashing the process 25 times, and after 25 times, iOS is not going to store any additional crash log. This is why we could see a gap between the HomeKit and the messages blast service crashes. So they use some DOS vulnerabilities first. They're not burning their actual vulnerabilities used, and then they start to transfer afterwards to the real vulnerabilities. Yeah. Still, there's lots of OPSECs that could have been done a lot better in that case. The excessive crashes were caught here, and we found multiple samples in the backup. Yeah. Is this the end for the specific sample? We still don't know the HomeKit vulnerability, and at the time I didn't know how they were able to actually start the NS expression. This is something that Ian Beer mentioned at this talk, and I'm just leaving the slides here as an answer, but you can check out his talks. I'm going to put a reference in the slides later on. So at the very end, that chain looked like this. We had a first stage, which was HomeKit. We have stage 0 HomeKit, stage 1, which is WebP. We had the NS expression, we had the payload X, and some of the implant that comes later. This is just a short overview for later review of the timeline, same as the IOCs that were gathered here. Now let's briefly take some time and talk about the current state of detections. This slide should show you a lot of the mitigations that iOS had added over time and time in order to prevent the exploitation of the device. This is not a full list or even a complete list. This is just some mitigations that I picked out. And you can also see what are mitigations or measures that Apple included since iOS 14 in order to tell us about certain threat notifications of if a device has been maybe attacked by commercial spyware, or even iOS vulnerabilities which have been actively exploited. But as you can see, there is not a single mitigation that Apple implemented in order to help us detecting those specific commercial spyware samples on device. Here's a couple of organizations that publish and research on commercial spyware vendors. There's a lot in the civil society space which did a really awesome job over the last couple of years to actually raise the issue of that problem and provide us with a lot of the fundamental technologies. There's a couple of private companies that are also publishing research and which is getting more and more track. But there is not a lot of companies that are actually specifically focused on the forensic work. I just know about two. If we're looking at the state of malware detection in 2022, this was already not really looking great. And at a talk 2 years ago, I already said it would be really great if we would get an endpoint security framework for iOS in order to detect such threats on device. But we didn't get it. This is how it changed with 2023. Now, at least some people were setting more focus on malware detection, but we still didn't get any security research devices. And this is how it looks in 2024. We see there's a lot of things that have progressed a little bit over time for the defensive community, and a lot of companies and individuals are now going more and more into doing more. But there is still a lot of things that are not really great. For example, we don't have a lot of exchange and knowledge transfer between private companies and the civil society, which makes it very hard if every single organization would need to come up with their own techniques in order to detect something, and everyone is just keeping stuff for themselves. The only thing, in my opinion, that this is benefiting or the entities that is benefiting at the moment are actually commercial spyware vendors. I hope that we can change something there over time in the next couple of years, but we'll see. Another thing that I have seen is that security hygiene, very often for individuals and companies, it's a huge issue. I don't know how often I have seen devices from persons that have been attacked time over time again by commercial spyware, and there's still the iOS version was like 6, 7, 8 months outdated. Same for companies that the very, very basic things of managing mobile devices are not just followed. There is a lot of work that we have to do here over time. And in this specific case, if we want to detect commercial spyware because it needs user interaction, we're not able to do it without the users. And in case of Apple, I haven't seen any specific change over the last 2 years. Just code quality and exploitation is still great. We don't have any issue on the preventive side or on the mitigation side. We just have an issue on the visibility side and on supporting the research of forensics, because security research devices are meant for people that want to find vulnerabilities, but not for people that want to analyze commercial spyware or even find some of the forensic traces. A brief note on security versus privacy. This is a very delicate balance that Apple obviously has to find. If you have too less visibility on a system, you're making the privacy part for like the majority of the population very, very great. But for some individuals, which are attacked with like the most intricate type of malware, that level of missing visibility actually leads to the fact that their complete privacy is compromised. On the other hand, if we have too much visibility, we're harming privacy. If we have too less security on a device, we're also harming privacy. I'm not saying that we should have full visibility on the iPhone, but in my personal opinion, I think it would be time that Apple starts to thinking about more different user groups and having dedicated forensic capabilities for some of the most targeted persons on the planet would probably be something good. And I personally think that this decision should not be done by a company itself. It should be a decision that needs to be done by the individual person if they want their device to be investigated. Or it should be also something that we need to discuss as a society. But the current state of commercial spyware actually allows you to attack masses of devices and without no chance of detection. This is just a courtesy slide that you can read after the talk. Some of the guidelines for targeted persons. These are all very public recommendations, and I can only highly suggest to follow those. A short note on if lockdown mode is able to prevent all attacks. Absolutely no. Should you use it anyhow? Absolutely yes. It's a very great tool in order to reduce a lot of attack surface on iOS, and I can highly suggest to use it. But still, it's not a silver bullet. Attackers are going to find ways around it. Let's chat briefly about how commercial spyware might change in 2022. What I might suspect is that they might move their initial infiltration to lesser protected areas, like third-party applications, WhatsApp, Signal, Threema, other Apple services, mail calendar, or something that we have seen in the past. And something that no one, I don't think, ever actually looks is what happens with an Apple Watch, a HomePod, a Vision Pro, AirPods, whatever other Apple devices you can look at. I don't know how to do forensics on some of those. And I don't think anyone is actually looking. Also, something that we have started to seeing is that attackers are using multiple exploits for multiple targets, or maybe they're just like stopping at exfiltrating a WebKit database, or depending on what the actual target is. But at some point in time, the model of using an RCE, sandbox escape, a kernel exploit, and an implant might be over. We're going to see that also attackers are going to professionalize cleanup more and more and more. That means post-mortem analysis, doing like twice a year, will get extremely hard if you're not regularly collecting forensic artifacts. And for some of these attacks and some of these devices, we need to move to continuous monitoring if we really want to detect such malware. Okay, I know it's past Christmas, but I still have a wish list for 2025. I would love if we could see improved Apple threat notifications. I would like to see details about the detected malware, some of the IOCs that Apple found. I would love to get details about the state of an attack. Did they only see that there were start of an infiltration? Did they see a successful infection? I would like to see timeframes and dates, which allow me to do a lot easier triage of what is going on in that device and finding samples or even more artifacts. I would absolutely love to see improved detection capabilities, and getting an endpoint security framework on iOS could go a long way. If we would get just access to a running process list on iOS, we could have detected all public malware samples in the last 8 years, and we could have prevented a lot of public malware infections in the last 8 years. And it would raise attackers' cost significantly. I know this is a topic where there's lots of debate going on, but I do think it would go a long way. I would love to see a lot of collaboration and sharing on the defense side. I've mentioned that. And just on the work on BlastPass, we had lots of duplicated work. So collaboration on malware analysis, sharing on malware samples of techniques and IOCs could benefit all the organizations in the space, and at the very end could benefit the victims and targets of commercial spyware. For Apple, once again, a dedicated program for forensic and malware reverse engineering. And a couple of open research topics. I don't think we actually understand the problem of commercial spyware on the target space good enough. So doing a scientific study about the proliferation and finding out how many people are actually attacked or targeted by spyware over the last couple of years, I think that would benefit the discussion a lot. Because currently everyone thinks it's a targeted attack and mostly focused on civil society. Our own data shows very much that there is a group variety of people that are targeted, but we don't have any proper scientific study that we could use as a basis for a discussion. Obviously, public research on iOS attack surface and techniques is always welcome, and forensics on Apple Watch, HomePod, and Vision Pro. And once again for Apple, also documentation or analysis of the various databases or files and forensic sources would highly welcome. I'd like to mention some thanks and some credits. Amnesty International, Citizen Lab, Access Now, and whoever in the civil society space that did a lot of work in the past. Without your work, I would not be able to stand up here. So there's just like a lot of credit and a lot of the foundational work that is done by these organizations that just like deserve our thanks. And the same for some private entities like Google Project Zero, Google Tag, and Cisco Talos over the space, and many, many others. So I can just say thank you for all the hard work that you did. And yeah, without a lot of these organizations, I would not be able to do this. And that's it.
Thanks for the talk. Questions. I'm sure there are plenty of questions. So we have mics on the sides, on both sides. I guess I start with the one.
Does it work? Okay. Well, thank you very much. Great talk. Can you mention something about the kind of data these spyware normally subtract from your phone? You mentioned location. That's quite obvious. But what kind of data is easy to subtract, and what kind of data they would like to subtract?
Very often they're subtracting passwords, they're subtracting iMessage databases, chat databases, some of the other files that they can find on the system. Whatever kind of social interaction contact lists that they're able to get. Very often you have predefined lists of hundreds of chat applications that they're targeting after.
Yeah, thank you.
The people leaving, can you please do that very quietly? Because otherwise we can't hear any Q&A. So please, if you're leaving, or best you just stay for the Q&A. It's interesting, but please be very quiet and stop talking. Next one on the number 3.
Hello, great talk, thanks. I guess my question is a little bit off topic. Have you looked at Graphene OS, and what do you think about the countermeasures and the attack surface for this hardened ROM?
I'm not really an Android guide, so I know that some of the countermeasures are pretty good, but I'm not the right person to talk actually about Graphene OS, so I can't really judge it from my opinion.
Okay, but thanks for the talk. It was great, thanks.
Next question from the microphone number 4.
Hello. I was wondering if the behavior of phones that are infected, like running hot, batteries running out, stuff getting slow, is this still like behaviors that can indicate infection, or is this past?
Sometimes you will observe some of that behavior, but Apple's software quality is unfortunately not as good as it was. I very often saw similar behavior and there was just nothing on those devices. I would not count on that. Spyware has gotten a lot better in order to just like leave minimal traces, but sometimes some of those changes are like unavoidable.
Thank you.
Do we have questions from the internet before we continue here? Signal Angel, do we have questions? If so,
how do you make questions on the internet?
you can just like write them into Mastodon or the IRC.
Yeah, so we have one question from the internet about where you get the samples of spyware or possibly infected samples.
Yeah, some of these samples are publicly available. So there is a sample of iSoon that is, I think, available on VirusTotal. There's a sample of Operation Triangulation. We captured a couple of samples by ourselves, and sometimes we're working together with entities that are sharing samples or that are giving us a readout of what is happening. But I think there is in total maybe 4 to 5 samples that I do know about.
Next question, mic 1.
For the wishes for 2025 or 2026, as a defensive mode, would it make sense for targeted individuals to get their phones scanned on like a weekly basis when they meet for meetings or something like that?
Absolutely. The more frequent you can check your phones, the better it is. And the more data you collect over time, the easier it is obviously for us to find traces if we even get a hold of an IOC later on. I can only recommend this at the current state because this is the only chance we have to capture something.
Microphone 3, next question.
Yes. For the encryption of the NS expressions, was the encryption custom or was it like a library that was being used?
This was pretty standard AES 256. I think with the initiation vector was pretty much standard. But it's, as NS expressions are using Objective-C methodology, they just use the custom OS function to do that.
Okay. Thank you.
Microphone 4.
My question is, like, when you jumped from receiving a logo.png on iMessage to run code with this NX execute, I didn't understand that. And the other question is, what you recommend as contents about the same topic but on Android, if you know?
So the first part is I can recommend check out my talk at Black Hat Asia. It's called You Shall Not Pass. I'm going to very much into detail on how you get from the plist file, very initial logo.png to the plist file. But essentially, I stumbled on a couple of strings which were called function, and I knew that those were a part of NS expressions. I'll put the links to the talks later on in references in the slide deck when I'm uploading it. Second question, unfortunately, I'm not really an Android guy. I know that Amnesty has some very excellent resources on that available, so check out their Security Tech Lab site or even MBT.
Do we have more Signal questions, like from the internet?
Yes, one question asking, I know you said you're not an Android guy, but people are asking if the focus on iOS is because that's what targets tend to use, or interesting targets use, or if that's because that's where the insecurity is.
So my personal focus was always interesting, like to find exploits or like stuff on iOS, and I just jumped into that and I never switched, but it's not because Android is not attacked. I decided to specify on that, but definitely there is a lot of targets on Android as well. As far as I know, gathering forensic artifacts from Android is even a lot harder than on iOS, which is kind of interesting because the operating system is so open. But yeah.
Next question, microphone 1.
So with the move from NClick exploits to one-click spyware, zero-click spyware, does it make sense to like restart your phone every day just in case? And could you implement a mitigation, like if the OS detects that a system process crashed 20 times in the last hour, then just restart?
That would actually probably be a very interesting mitigation for Apple to implement and would probably help. But it's also, sometimes iOS processes do crash repeatedly in the background, and those are not malicious crashes. You just don't notice that. So it also has some impact on the user experience. In terms of restarting your phone every day, absolutely. But also do collect some forensic data from time to time, because just restarting is also killing, obviously, like any kind of artifacts that an attacker might have left behind on that.
Okay, thank you.
Microphone 3.
Hi, great talk. Thanks for it. And I have a question, and maybe I missed this part. How can a user know or can tell that his device is potentially infected so that they can call us, SOC analysts or forensics, so that we can start our analysis?
You have not missed that part. The actual bad thing about that is there is no clear telling style. That is the issue that we have. Commercial spyware got so good at being stealthy on the device that you will not be able to notice that your phone is infected as long as you're not doing the forensic investigation and checking. So this is like a chicken and an egg problem in some way. It might be at some cases, if something goes clearly wrong, that your phone might like heat up over time, battery is draining very, very often. There is cases where this happened, but on the majority, you're not going to notice a single thing.
Okay, thank you. So a regular check will do it fine in this case.
This is the best I can tell you until we get better tools to automatically check something in the background. But you just try to get as frequent checks as possible.
Okay, thank you.
Microphone 4, next question.
Yes, does a full reset of an iPhone destroys the spyware, and what will happen if you restore a compromised backup? Is the spyware still on the device then?
From a practical standpoint, even a reboot normally wipes the spyware from the device because they don't want to leave any traces behind. So from what I know, like even if you would wipe your device, you would clean it completely, but in theory it would also be possible that someone finds a way to infect the phone via a backup and reinfect it again. But that is obviously very, very noisy in terms of leaving traces behind.
Do we have more internet questions?
Yes, the internet would like to know how many devices had lockdown mode enabled which were exploited.
I can't really tell you that. In most cases, people did not have lockdown mode enabled, that of the phones we analyzed, but I also haven't tracked that. I just know there is some cases where there are vulnerabilities or exploits have been found that are just on cases where lockdown mode is not impacting the device, like the security of the device.
So I guess we have time for like one last question. One last person is standing here. Maybe if there are more questions, maybe you're around afterwards to come to you directly. But for the rest, the last question at microphone number 3.
Hi, thank you for your talk. Did you already look into Apple Indigo? And if yes, what is your opinion on this from a security perspective for devices in government use?
I have not looked at the detailed implementation, but as far as I understood, it's also in MDM with a specific set of configuration which is used, which is great of reducing attack surface, but it's not going to give you any dedicated better ways of finding threats on the devices. So that means for governments, I can only recommend to do the same thing as everyone else, gather as much forensic artifacts as possible and do frequent analysis of those.
Thank you.
Well, I guess it was the last question, and like our time is up. So thanks a lot, Matthias, for this great talk and great insight. Please give a round of applause to Matthias for this talk.